I was like to start, like it was like the idea is to present yourself and like to tell us a little bit what is your background and how you happen to become a photographer. But like
okay, well, I'm not a photographer.
Yeah, that's
to begin with.
Or like,
so I am a huge devotee of photography, but I'm not a photographer. I spend a large portion of my life dealing with photography and working with photographers. And a lot of people consider me somewhat of an image hoarder because obviously that's what is portrayed on social media. I am a graphic designer by trade. It's what I do. It's what I love to do. It's what I've always wanted to do. I think I knew I wanted to be a graphic designer even before I knew what that meant, what it was. When I grew up in Europe. I spent my most of my formative years in Europe. I was born in Jordan. My parents are Palestinian. So, I've kind of done this global trajectory, and that I consider myself very lucky. But when I was living in London as a child, I became very obsessed with the visual world. I would take my mother's magazines and I would cut them up, and then I would rearrange them in a scrapbook. And I didn't really know why, and I didn't really know what the reason was that I was doing it, but I knew that it was a very obsessive thing for me. So I went to art school. Fast forward, I went to art school. I graduated from art school. I became a graphic designer. And not that I necessarily want to age myself right now, but 30 years later, I'm still a graphic designer. In my own mind, I'm a graphic designer. But obviously, I have ascended to much more senior positions in very big companies. So I have this double life that I live, which is sort of corporate executive, senior management, creative director for a big beauty brand by day, and then all the other shit that I do by night or by day also. But just to sort of give you that roundedness. So I live in New York City. I've lived here for 25 years. We moved here from Paris 25 years ago. I was pregnant with my first child, and I was like, you know what, fuck this shit. I don't want to live in Paris anymore. Paris, this isn't the right place to be. I think Chirac had just become, president, and it just didn't feel right. So we moved to New York. I didn't know anyone, didn't know anything, and sort of restarted our careers from nothing, from zero, and with no real plan. I think that's sort of a lot of how things have happened in our lives. There's no real plan whatsoever. And now 25 years later, I'm still here. Although right now, with everything that's going on in this country, I'm like, you know what? Maybe this is the fall of the American empire, and maybe it's time to leave again. But it's still here, and the things that I like to do, I'm still able to do. So I consider myself very lucky. And if you want me to talk about this specific project, I actually at the moment.
But maybe we can come slightly later. So because it's actually good also to precise what you said about your present activities, and maybe if you could maybe just describe also your activity as creative directors and how your love for image and photography is important in this activity.
Well, so I'm the creative director for Revlon currently. It's one of the biggest beauty brands in the world. It's a mass brand. That's a first for me. I've never worked in a mass product before. I've always worked in luxury and prestige. Before that, I lived in Japan for 2 years, and I was the creative director for Shiseido. I was their first foreign creative director, I believe, in their 150-year history. And before that, I was at Estee Lauder for almost a decade as creative director for another beauty brand. So I have this, like I said, this double life. But, so obviously as a creative director for a beauty brand, visuals, photography, packaging, color, three-dimensional objects, all of that stuff is very prevalent in my world. Also, as of the last decade, I would say, the digital space has become very, very, very important, and how to translate, all kind of marketing and PR and publicity is now digital first focused, which is, I think, is really fascinating because I love the digital world. I mean, I love the tactile world, don't get me wrong. I still love the printed page. I was, when I left art school, when I graduated, there wasn't a single computer on our campus, not one. I think the next year they started to introduce them. So when I started as a graphic designer, I was doing things manually, paste up. My first job at Condé Nast in Paris, we were doing things paste up. We were pasting up by hand. The greatest thing that ever came into our industry was the photocopying machine. That sort of changed everything for us because we didn't have to resize things, with a pencil and a piece of paper. But now, obviously, 25 years later, 30 years later, the entire world has changed. So my job consists of, especially at Revlon right now as well, Revlon is attempting to a renaissance of sorts, because it sort of lost its way over the last, I would say, 2 decades. It was a very strong, visually important brand for many, many, many years. It had many firsts. It was actually the company that invented nail polish. Opaque nail polish was invented by this company. And I know that sounds very trivial, but nail polish is very important to women today. I mean, there isn't a woman in New York City, maybe it's not so much in Europe, but in America, getting your nails done is like brushing your teeth. So it was a very forward-thinking company. And, the first advertising campaign that was ever shot for this company was shot by Richard Avedon. So we're talking about a legacy of extraordinary photographers, extraordinary work at this company that sort of got lost, I would say, like I said, 2 decades ago. And I think that's because at one point it was a creative-driven company, and then, like most companies, it became a marketing-driven company, a data-driven company, a focus group-driven company. And it's still that today. So that's my biggest battle. My biggest battle is, I don't give a shit what your data says. This is the right thing to do. And so I always have that huge fight and that huge frustration, because I just don't think the corporate structure today really works. I don't think it makes any sense. I don't think it's of value. I think we've built these very bloated, dysfunctional companies that don't produce good work, that don't allow for good work to be produced. And I think COVID has really brought that all to the surface. And I believe that America is going to rethink their corporate structures across every brand, from the smallest to the biggest. I do believe that. And I hope that it's going to be for the better.
Yeah.
Because there is nothing I hate more, there is nothing I rage against more than a corporate structure. And yet, I sit in a corporate structure every single day. So it is this absolute, this weirdness that I live every day, where I rage against the machine and rage against the man, and that I am the man to some degree. But when I'm inside, I don't consider myself the man. And I think that they see me as very rebellious. They see me as very rebellious. And it's very interesting because some of them are very forgiving, because ultimately I do good work. I hope I do good work, but I do good work, or the work that I do brings results. But they fight me all the way to the results, all the way.
at least you managed to do it, so it's good. But so like, and then like one more question, but that also leads us to the project. It's also your relationship to social media, and like, and also, you know, in the world of fashion, like how influencers and like different kind of social media like Instagram have completely redo or reshuffle the game. So, and you seem to be also pretty involved in social media. So, could you just also tell us a few words about like the way you deal with social media?
Social media from a corporate perspective, or my own social media?
I think from that point we can speak from your perspective, like, yeah.
My social media channel, and I think I entered the social media world, I would say about 10 years ago. My social media channel is very personal, and it's very interesting to me because, you know, corporations have been kind of struggling. What do we do with people who work for companies who don't share the same opinions, or who can be too outspoken or too volatile or too risky in terms of what, you know, how do they, I think corporations are really, and I have struggled with this voice, like, do we let our employees say what they want on their own social media channels, because ultimately they work for this company. So in America, I really think, I don't know if it's the same in Europe, because I haven't worked in Europe in a company in, like I said, 25 years. The company owns you to a large degree. Your views and their views kind of have to really match. And clearly, if you look at my social media, that's absolutely not the case. And so I've thought about it a few times, and then I've also kind of come to the conclusion that I refuse to adhere to these unwritten rules. So my social media is very much my perspective. My social media is, so for example, I work for a beauty brand. I will speak and post and I will speak highly or speak lowly about other beauty brands. It doesn't, but lots of people have come to me and said, "Oh my God, you posted X brand, and how can you do that if you work for this brand?" And my point of view is, we all live in the same world, right? We can't negate what is going on in the world. And if I feel something is aesthetically pleasing or it speaks to me, I'm not going to, by these unwritten rules, ignore it. So I just ignore all the rules and do exactly what I want. And I think what's happened, and I think, again, I know COVID is fairly recent, but COVID has basically opened up that whole situation, and the whole Black Lives Matter movement, the whole defunding the police, the whole like burning down the system has allowed everybody to say whatever they want, wherever they want. And no one is going to dare say anything. I think there's a big fear at corporations to offend at this point. So I'm like, oh great, now I have now no one can say anything to me. Now I'm going to let the dogs out. So I post about, you know, political things. I scream at the NYPD. I don't give a shit. And no one's tapped on my shoulder yet and said, "What the hell are you doing?" So I'm going to keep pushing that envelope.
Yeah, that sounds pretty stimulating. And can you just tell us about how you started to document the riots, and like what was the drive that kind of pushed you like to take your camera and go and your, you know, to...
So okay, so there was so many layers and levels to this. So we've got, all of a sudden, from one day to the next, we're told your lives are about to change. Around the middle of March, I think it was the 13th, Friday the 13th was the last day we were in the office. Our lives changed dramatically. We were told, go home. We don't know when you're going to come back. Maybe in a week, maybe in 2 weeks. I actually follow the news very closely. My brother is a journalist, and he is a very smart journalist. He spends a lot of, he had warned me weeks ago. He said, look, read what the CDC are saying, read what the World Health Organization is saying. This is a really serious thing. Even I, at that point, I mean, I'm talking about a month prior to New York shutting down, he was like, you better be careful. You're going to stay home. You're not going to, the whole world is about to change. And even I didn't believe him, but he was, a month later, he was absolutely correct and right. So I go home and we're all told we're going to be working from home. I wake up Monday morning and literally New York City had changed. I look outside of my window and I live in a really busy part. I live in Soho. So I live in a place where it's filled with tourists, and I live in the kind of the gritty part of Soho. So there's a lot of noise. There's a lot of activity. It's 24-hour activity as well. It's not, New York doesn't, that myth about New York not sleeping, it's true. There is something going on 24 hours a day here. So I wake up, the next morning and it is deathly silent. I can actually hear the birds. And I think it's the first time in 25 years that I could hear the birds. And it was a moment, I think, for all of us of absolute panic. We didn't know what to do with ourselves. We didn't know how to react to this. And we were told, well, you've just got to stay home. And then, slowly but surely, we sort of got used to that. Monday morning I woke up. I didn't know how I was going to work because I was so used to this very kind of specific, you get up, you have your breakfast, you go to work, you stay in your office. There was a real conditioned, like Pavlovian structure in a way that we were so used to, that I've been used to my entire career. So I think it took all of us a while to kind of figure out how to function at all, when to eat, when to wake up, when to get dressed, and it was hard. It was really hard. The city really did shut down from one day to the next. The stores closed. It was a very tense city as well because we were the number one hotspot for COVID in the world. Mm. And I kind of knew that because we are also at the crossroads. We are where whenever anybody enters the United States, it's one of the ports of entry. We are also a very, very, when you think of New York, I think people who've never been to New York think of New York as this huge, huge, huge place. It's a huge city. Actually, the 5 boroughs are pretty big, but Manhattan is actually a tiny little island. It's very dense, but it's very small. Mm-hmm. You can walk from the East River to the West River to the west in about, I would say, 45 minutes. It's a 45-minute walk between East and West. It's not that big. Mm. So I can understand why we became such a hot spot. And, and it was a dire emergency. There was not enough ventilators, not enough PPE. All you could hear were ambulances. All you could hear and you could hear deathly silence. And that stayed like that for a really, 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 really long time. And it was, you kind of got used to it after a while, but you could feel that there was this pent up energy that was brewing under the covers, and simmering. And also there was a lot of the rich left. 40% of rich New Yorkers left the city. So there was this, and I think this is a very important point, because they looked at zip codes and they looked at phone records, and and my neighborhood was empty. The Rolls Royces and the Porsches and the Maseratis and the Lamborghinis all disappeared from the street because this neighborhood is still pretty interesting. Part of it is still gritty, and a lot of artists still live here. They've been living here for 50 years. I have neighbors in my building who've lived in this building for 50 years. They lived in this building when there was no electricity in this building. They lived in this building when they were the only people living in this building, if you can imagine such a thing. And then on the other side, we've got people who have apartments worth $10 million, who are, venture capitalists or bankers or whatever the fuck these people do. And so there was this, you could feel this solidarity, like we, the New Yorkers who stayed here, we, the New Yorkers who stuck it out, we, the New Yorkers who are here, distributing water or taking our lost, whatever it is to the nurses, and distributing food to those who are unemployed. And I think we needed the world. The death of George Floyd was a tragic and unfortunate incident, but it was the catalyst that changed everything. Not just for New York City. I think New York City was very specific in the way that it reacted to it. I think a lot of major cities, and it's still ongoing. If you look at Seattle right now, if you look at Portland, Chicago, New York, there are still demonstrations to this day in New York. They're much smaller, but they're still happening. And I think that catalyst, that was it was the spark that exploded the city. Because the city was brewing, it was simmering. Everybody was sitting at home, and it was a moment of release, and it was a moment of rage, and I think it was this perfect storm of rage against the government, rage against Trump, rage against the abomination of the election of Trump, rage against the frustration of feeling helpless for COVID. Also, the governor of New York was a really important, I knew that Andrew Cuomo was the governor of New York. That's all I knew. I didn't give a shit. He was up in Albany. He was a politician. He was a good guy, a bad guy. I didn't really care. It didn't make any. His policies made no difference to my life. And so he emerged as this voice of strength for New Yorkers, as this voice of reason, and this emotional voice where you have this unemotional reaction and flippant, disrespectful reaction from the federal government. You've got the local government saying, we're going to look after you. So you have this frustration, you have this rage, you have this emotion, you have this fear, you have all these things coming to the surface. And I say this because there isn't a New Yorker who you will speak to who will say differently. Not one. Whether they're rich or poor or unemployed or employed or any of that stuff. And then the death of George Floyd was the spark. All it was, it lit that flame, and people went into the streets. And people went into the streets, and it wasn't just about the death of George Floyd. That was the spark. It was everything else that is wrong with this country. It was everything else that people have been feeling for the last 4 years or the last 20 years. And it sort of started, we've had 4 years of trash. We've had 10 years of trash. Oh, let's take it back to the civil rights movement. And you had the youth, for the first time in my 25 years of living in this country, I saw them react. And I saw them react because they were sitting at home. They didn't have to go to work. They didn't have work to go to. They didn't have anything else but to feel this rage. And I've said it many, many years. I don't understand why Americans are so complacent. The French, as soon as they hear anything that displeases them, they shut the country down. I lived in France for a decade. Every other day there was a general strike. Every other day the city was shut down for one reason or another. And they shut the cities down. And Europeans have this, Europeans have, brought down governments. And there was this deep complacency in this country that I could never understand. And I think it was the underserved, the underdog, just thought they had no option. They were very complacent. And then the others were very happy with the status quo. And I think that entire thing has been turned on its head. So what happened was rage from these demonstrations. And of course, as soon as I saw that, I wanted to see it. I mean, I have this I don't know. It's not, I didn't feel like a voyeur. I felt like I wanted to participate in this. So I participated in the demonstrations. They were on my doorstep. They were in my neighborhood. And a lot of the people who who were demonstrating were my friends. They're people I knew. They're people I spend time with. So we demonstrated, and demonstrations happen every single day. At the beginning, the demonstrations were not were the police, the NYPD. Let the demonstrations happen to some degree, but very quickly, for one reason or another, the NYPD decided that they didn't want to let Americans have their right to demonstrate. People have the right to demonstrate. This is supposed to be a democracy. People have the right. They have the thing that they call their First Amendment right. I have the right to free speech. I have the right to. Well, that was all being quashed. And that, I think, the government, the city, did not actually underestimated how people would react to that. So I was in the middle of demonstrations where the NYPD, this is something really interesting. Afterwards, I really want to talk about the NYPD, who I actually will put on the record, loathe and despise. They reacted wrong, and I think they miscalculated how people would react. People voluntarily were arrested. I watched people getting arrested. I watched people getting beaten up. It was us against them, and the people decided that they weren't going to take it anymore. And things very, very quickly began to escalate. And within a few days, I watched New York City burn down. I saw things that you read about in the history books. I saw things that you don't think that you're ever going to see in your lifetime. I saw things that were, quite frankly, shocking to me. But at the same time, I felt, and this is going to be very misunderstood, I felt were justified. I felt that there was a justification to what was happening. That the underdog, that the underserved, that the people who are constantly being quashed in this society and ignored were not going to take it anymore. And there was a lot of debate about, well, I watched because I live in Soho, so I have a Louis Vuitton around the corner. I have a Balenciaga down the street. I have a Chanel, in and amongst all of this, there's a lot of luxury brands in this neighborhood. It's a very tourist neighborhood. I watched Gucci is around the corner. I watched the kids break into the stores, destroy the windows, and take what they could. And I don't think it was about having material goods. I think it was about making a point. I saw kids stand on the steps of the Gucci store, take the stuff out of it, and throw it out onto the street. This was almost like what I read about in the French Revolution. This was, we fuck the system. Mm-hmm. It's not that I want these Gucci pants. I don't give a shit about these Gucci pants. It was really funny because I saw people just put them on and walk away and not give a shit. But also they were just throwing them out onto the street. This was a simmering frustration for an entire generation that between COVID and the death of George Floyd, that was what ignited. There's always that one incident that ignites the riot. So I recorded it. I recorded what I saw. I recorded, I filmed, I recorded. I grabbed my son's friends from the skate parks who all have cameras, because skateboarders have this. And somebody needs to do an exhibit about this. Why are skateboarders so creative? Why is skateboarding a sport that always attracts creative people? I grabbed them. We went out on bikes. I was like, you film here, I film here, I take these pictures, you film here. And we recorded
like a little team.
Yeah, I grabbed a team. They were all, I think the oldest one was 20.
Okay.
That was the oldest one. I grabbed a team. Their work is going to be featured in this exhibit. I'm actually going to meet with them next week, and we're going to gather all of the material, because I think it's not just about my material. Yeah. Many people documented this, and it's a sum of parts. And it's not about me as an artist. when Natalie called me, I was quite shocked. It took me a few days to even respond, because to be included in an exhibit in a museum, that connotes that I'm to some degree an artist. And never in my life have I ever used that word in conjunction with myself. Other people are artists, great photographers, great painters, great sculptors. These are the people who I revere, and I can name them. I mean, I have real heroes in my repertoire, but I wasn't one of them. I was the one on the sidelines who was, as a creative director or a graphic designer, what you do, you're the frame for the art, right? You design a book, so you take someone else's work and you just put it in a book to make it look as beautiful as you can. That was my role. So now all of a sudden my role is being reversed, whereas I'm being put forward as the artist, and I don't see myself that way. So in order for me to find my comfort level again, I have to curate. So I have to bring other people on board and give them the opportunity to speak as well, because for me, it's not just about my voice. So we recorded everything. We were out all night. We were out, I think on one night we were out for 24 hours because it just never ending. And what was very interesting is what ended up transpiring is a month prior, Nick Knight, who is a very revered photographer, has this platform called Show Studio. He called me and he said, "Would you like to do a takeover of our social media for the beginning of May?" He said. And I said, "No, I don't have time for the beginning of May." And he said, "Because I see what you're walking around New York City, you're photographing the death of the city." Because I was walking around and photographing streets which were empty, which in their history had never been empty. In the entire history of New York City, I could see from one end of the street all the way 10 blocks down, and you couldn't see another human being. And he said, "I want you to do something that speaks to basically COVID, what's happened to New York City." And so I agreed, and I started working on that. And I started working on, a programming for a full week, a takeover of social media. And that's a lot of work, because when you do seven pieces of content every day for 7 days, that's a lot of content. What happened is literally the 2 days before I was supposed to do the takeover, or the day before I was supposed to do the takeover for Show Studio for Nick Knight, I was in the streets, and I was recording one of the most violent riots that happened on that day. And I was like, "Oh shit, I've got to do this Show Studio thing tomorrow." And the way that I programmed it was going to be, I think, about art, or I don't even remember what it was. But I can't do that. I can't wake up tomorrow morning and talk about this subject, because it's no longer relevant. The world has just changed overnight. So I logged into their account, turned my camera on, turned it to me, and said, "Okay, it's 1:30 in the morning, New York City, Soho. This is what's going on." And I live recorded that, I think, from about 1:30 in the morning to maybe about 5 a.m., what was happening in New York City. And I was like, "Oh shit, you know what?" And I thought about it several times, like, well, Nick is going to wake up and the Show Studio people are going to wake up in the morning, because it's my night. They're still sleeping. Yeah. And they're going to be like, "What the fuck did she just do?" And I was like, "But this is the world we live in. If they don't like it, they can take it down." And so I live Instagrammed all night, and they woke up to that. They woke up to what I witnessed and what I experienced. And then the rest of the week was continued that way. The rest of the week was violence and rage against the NYPD and looting and burning of streets and burning of cars and more protests and it has continued until very recently. Mm. And so the last, I would say, between middle of March to today, New York City has changed like I don't think it's ever seen a change in its entire history. in terms of social upheaval. New York City is now in its phase 4 of opening, so it is looking more normal again, but it's a very abnormal normal. And I don't think that it is going to ever be normal again in the way that it was before. I think too many questions have been asked, too many subjects and frustrations have been brought to the surface, and I do think it's important to record them, to put them in the history books. And so when Natalie called me and said, "Oh, I want you to do something about New York City," it's so funny because Nick Knight said the same thing to me. Nick Knight said, "You love New York City. I can tell how much you love New York City by how you inhabit it. So I want you to do something about New York." And Natalie said the same thing to me. And one of the things I wanted to say, actually, that's really interesting that I forgot to say is when New York City shut down, before the riots, before the looting, some of the stores, the luxury stores, boarded up their windows, boarded them up.
Yes, I wanted to ask you about that.
Yeah, not all of them, some of them. And I was like, oh shit, this is going to be amazing. Because what these stores have done is they've created canvases for artists. And so I called my friend Steve Powers, Espo. He's a very well-known graffiti artist in New York City. He's an old school, old graph guy. And I said, we should go paint these storefronts. Let's go. And he's brilliant. Also, his message is one of love and sort of bringing people together. And so it would have been a great message. And he said, oh, I know you and I are thinking the same thing. I've tried. I called Louis Vuitton and they said no. And I called blah and they said no. And I said, well, why don't we do it illegally? And he said, because I don't want to get arrested. I really don't want to deal with the NYPD. You know, he has a wife at home and a kid. And I was like, fuck you, Espo. But he did get permission to do one massive storefront here in Soho, and he painted it. And it was the only storefront that was painted in all of Soho. And it became a destination. And I filmed him painting it from beginning to end. And I actually made a very short film for a show studio. And then, but so what was ending up happening is the stores weren't allowing painters to take over. But the graffiti kids were going out into the streets. They did not give a shit. And I was watching kids literally from my window on Canal Street at 1 o'clock in the morning, come up on their bikes or their skateboards, paint an entire storefront and just leave. And not give a shit because the NYPD and the first responders were worried about COVID. They were worried about, they weren't going to come up to and arrest a kid because at that time, nobody was wearing masks. It was a really scary time. Nobody wanted to go near each other. So these kids were the graffiti is still all over the city. And I was like, this is amazing. So when the commerce dies, the art is going to take over the city. And that's exactly what happened. It's what I told Espo. I said, Espo, if you don't do it, the kids are going to do it. He goes, oh, let the kids do it. Let the kids do it. So between the kids who have been super frustrated because the city has cracked down on graffiti so much that they get arrested, they get fined, they go to trial. It's actually considered a felony now, not even a misdemeanor. So it wasn't worth it to them. Trains were painted again for the first time since the 80s. So I was thrilled. I was like, damn, this is the New York City that should be, right? This is how we think of New York City. So I obviously went into the street, grabbed the kids, grabbed the bikes. I've ridden my bike so much that the other day I had a flat tire and I took it to the bike shop and they're like, you need to change your tires. What the hell have you been doing? I mean, we have ridden kilometers and kilometers and kilometers. And so we started recording the nighttime graffiti. We started recording the daytime graffiti, which wasn't as much as the nighttime graffiti. And then right after the riots, what did the storefronts do? First of all, there were all these stores that had no more glass in their windows. Immediately the next day, they boarded up every single storefront, and a lot of residential buildings boarded up their windows. Every single one in every single street in the city. Also, during the riots, just to go back to the riots, during the riots, Soho became a fortress. The NYPD, because that's where the stores are, that's where the luxury boutiques are. At night, and also don't forget, at one point, I think for a week we had a curfew, which was the best part of it. Because they imposed a curfew, which was, I think the first one was 11 p.m., and nobody gave a shit. They still rioted and burned down the city.
Yeah.
And then they changed it to 8 p.m. the next day. Nobody gave a shit. They didn't burn down the city, but they protested. But the problem was the NYPD knew that at this point, because the world was looking at them, they can't beat kids up anymore. They can't arrest kids anymore. So it was this challenge between the people, the kids, and the NYPD. Is like, come get us. You come get us. And they turned Soho into an absolute fortress. So they blockaded it from all the exits. You couldn't enter and exit into Soho. So what did they do? They just marched around Soho. They don't give a shit. Broadway is a very long street, and there's a lot of space to cover there. So it was a really interesting thing. So the police attacked, the kids continued, the police retreated because they felt stupid. And that's still ongoing. Like, it's still ongoing in that the NYPD are now somewhat they've been disempowered by the people. They are universally loathed by the people of New York City. There are very few people here who support them. And I've always wondered, I've always had this reaction in this country of why is it that when I see a police officer arresting someone, even though I don't know what's going on, I don't know what's happened, I always feel sorry for the person being arrested and have hatred towards the NYPD. And that's just the reaction I've had since the day I've moved here. And I think I realize now why that is because they are an army. They are a militia. They look like a militia. They behave like a militia. I grew up in London as a kid. There's a very different relationship between police officers and law enforcement in the UK versus here. And I didn't know that. I didn't, for me, when you grow up, my formative years were in London. So you grow up and you think, oh, well, yes, your police officer is there to help you. They walk the streets. They don't carry arms. They don't carry guns. They walk around here as if they're a terrorist organization. And I never understood why that was, but I had a visceral reaction. Like, I never analyzed it. Why do I hate the NYPD? The NYPD are also racist, openly racist. They will arrest black, brown kids. My son is 18 years old now. He turned 18 during COVID. He is a skateboarder. He is born and bred in New York City. He hangs out with kids who are less privileged than him. He understands. He has a deep understanding of social constructs. He understands. He's very conscious socially because he grew up watching his friends and him also being harassed and targeted by the NYPD. And also he's a skateboarder, so skateboarders are also the underdog. If he was a basketball player playing a basketball court, they wouldn't bother him, but because he's a skateboarder, he's automatically considered a thug. Whereas skateboarding's a sport. People who are very serious about skateboarding are athletes. So it's fascinating, and it's really interesting to see what is happening right now, and I'm very curious to see what will happen moving forward. What I want to show in this exhibit, I think I have a footage from a friend of mine. I didn't shoot it. I was in a different location where the violence of the NYPD against the people of New York City is so shocking. If you took out New York City, you would think it was some
dictatorship,
fascist state.
Yeah.
And so I actually want to show that film with no edit. I think it's about 4 minutes. And I don't think it should be edited. I think I should just show it as it is. So that's something that I'm going to talk to him about. There's also other absolutely shocking things. But to go back to the boarded up stores. So the day after the biggest riot, the day after there was, it was all night rioting, I woke up fairly early, left my house to take a walk to see what was going on. I mean, there were police cars that were burned to the ground on the streets. There were, you could see where things had been lit on fire. You could see where boards had been removed off the storefronts, and then the storefronts had been just destroyed. It was very early in the morning. It was sunny. It was very quiet. It was deathly quiet because nobody was outside. We were still under quarantine. And as I walked through Soho, every single storefront had an artist, painter with paintbrushes, rollers, spray cans, painting the storefronts. And what I had predicted was going to happen actually happened right after the riots, because what were the NYPD going to do? They were going to stop them painting. What were the store owners going to do? They were going to stop some kid writing Black Lives Matter on their storefront. What were they going to do? So everything that I predicted happened. And Soho was this absolute, every street, every storefront. To this day, they're still doing it. Yesterday, I was driving in the East Village, and there was a storefront that were these two girls. They were painting with paintbrushes. And it turned into this museum that dedicated to this moment in history. And they're still up there. Most of them are still up there. Some of the storefronts have been taken down. I was hoping that the Museum of the City of New York would take them and put them into their collection as part of the history of New York, because it is, in the same way that they took all of the dedications and the memorials after 9/11 and put them in this museum. But I'm not sure that that's happened. I don't think that there's, and I think everybody is in shock. I think people are still in shock. I think the administration is still in shock. I think people, I know a lot of storefronts of, you know, one of the stores where Espo painted, they took their boards and they sold them and they raised money for Black Lives Matter. But right now, it's sort of in between. So what I did is I documented every single storefront. I walked up and down the street every single day and just photographed what I saw. Sometimes with an iPhone, sometimes not with an iPhone. Sometimes I would, you know, and I called the kids, as I refer to them, and I said, go to this neighborhood, go up and down the street on your bike, film it, photograph it, do whatever you have to do. And so that's the stuff I have. And I now have to make kind of sense of it, of what I'm going to do with it for this space.
And the message, like the messages that were written on this boarded wall. I don't know, shop wall. I don't know you say.
The messages were very clear. The message, and it was very interesting because the messages started off with, they were very aggressive. They were, you know, George Floyd, Black Lives Matter, fuck 12, which is basically fuck the police, defund the NYPD, fuck the NYPD. There was a lot of fucks, a lot of that. It was a lot of, you know, it was a lot of Black Lives Matter messages, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Kaepernick, who, you know, lots of kneeling Kaepernick, lots of that. And so if you're a storefront owner, you're not taking that shit down. You're not covering it up. And then what ended up happening slowly as the riots stopped, as things started to calm down, as the aggression sort of became less, the messages started to change. It was imagine peace and one world and vote, a lot of vote, a lot of, still a lot of Black Lives Matter. Some of the art was really incredible. Some of it was incredibly detailed, very strong, very powerful. And then it became more institutional. You know, they recently painted Black Lives Matter, massive Black Lives Matter on the street in front of the main courthouse here downtown, where a lot of, you know, Black people are taken to court and taken into custody. And then they also did the same thing in front of the Trump Tower uptown, which I think is even better. And that was actually mandated by the city of New York. I think the mayor of New York actually painted one of the letters. So it became more institutionalized. And the messages became calmer. Like if I'm walking through the street right now, I'm going to see fewer fuck 12s and fewer fuck the NYPD and much more imagine peace and we need peace and we need a better world. So the messages changed. The messages, more flowers are being painted, more rainbows. It went from punk to hippie in about 3 weeks.
Is it the same messengers? Like, is it the same people that kind of evolved in their their work, or like is it different people now that?
I think it's different people. I think it's different people. I think the first messages were just messages of rage. A lot of people were looting and spray painting at the same time. So there was, the rage became more philosophical. The rage became more diplomatic in a way. So I do think it's different. I think it's different people. I think, but what is it that Martin Luther King said? Rage and rioting is the voice of the unheard. I mean, I'm paraphrasing. So, but it was the unheard. There is such a huge difference between the have and have-nots in this country. This was inevitable. This was absolutely inevitable. And this is a young country. I always say that America is like a petulant teenager. It's like a teenager in its drunken years, when they get drunk and do really irresponsible things, and they kind of aren't intelligent enough. I'm talking about the country as a whole, the country as an entity, not the people. They haven't quite experienced enough to understand how to do things wisely and with maturity, whereas Europe has gone through this. Europe's done this shit. They've done their fuck years. They've done the fuck shit. But America hasn't, and it's going through it right now. I mean, when you think of the civil rights movement, it was only in 1968. It was in our lifetimes. And nothing has really changed from that perspective. Nothing has changed. Black people have the right to vote, but they're not equal in this country. They're not equal. Black people, brown people, Arabs. Arabs, I think, are even lesser than black people. They're even less well considered. And they're also more invisible. So I do think, unless you're wearing a hijab or, over the Arab, and then you're just, trash. So I think this country is going through serious growing pains. I think this country is going through a moment of self-reflection, and it's violent. It is very violent. And I think that the most ridiculous part is, and I think what's also helped bring this to the surface is Trump. I mean, I also think that, if there's a silver lining to Trump, if I can even say such a thing, if these words can even come out of my mouth, is he is so incompetent, and he is such a fool, and he is such a crook, that he has permitted this to happen.
Of course. Yeah.
And that's the silver lining, I guess, to his presidency. Is under his presidency and his incompetence, the real America is reacting. And I don't think, and it's going to be very, very interesting to see what happens in a few months from now.
Yeah, that's also a question. Like you said that like you collaborated with your son's friends, and like your youth crew. What do you think about this generation, and how like that affected them, and like how they might, how are they going to step forward from that point?
I think it's very interesting, because I think a lot of these kids were complacent in terms of changing things. Like, I think that, first of all, I have been living here 25 years, and I just really began to understand how this country works from a electoral perspective. I always, they talk about being the greatest freedom and democracy and freedom and all this bullshit, but it's actual complete bullshit. This country is not a democracy. What one man and one vote is not how this country works. And I cannot explain the Electoral College to you, but I can tell you that it's not fair, and I can tell you that it makes no sense, and I can tell you that it needs to be abolished, and I can tell you that, when you think about it, they're so married to their constitution. They're so married to it, but the Constitution was written in the 17th century by a bunch of white men. The world, America of today, is not the America of when they wrote this Constitution. And the fact that they're so wedded to it and so married to it, and it can't be changed, and it can't excuse me, what the fuck are you talking about? This is not the same world that we live in. So I do think people are beginning to really, 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 and the democracy that they speak of is a democracy that was relevant perhaps in the 17th century, isn't relevant today. And
also, what I find so shocking, and I grew up in Europe, I've never heard of anything called voter suppression except in dictatorships. You know, you hear about fascist countries or Eastern European countries at the time before the fall of the Berlin Wall, and you hear about, you know, people not being able to vote or people not being able to vote in, you know, developing countries. This is what you hear about here in America. It's a big concern. And I'm like, this can't be true. This can't be possible. But it actually is true. In certain states, it is virtually impossible to vote. If you are black, if you are, you know, it is the most shocking thing I've ever seen in my life. So this can't be a democracy if it's not that easy to vote. And so I think all of this is coming to the surface, and I think the youth of today, they were relatively complacent because they were okay. They were okay. People were okay. But I think that things are going to change. I mean, my son turned 18 this year, and I think to vote. I mean, he's a U.S. citizen. He's a dual citizen, which is a really rare and interesting thing. He's a U.S. Swiss citizen, so he sees both sides of it. You know, both sides like Chanel, as to quote Frank Ocean. And he is, and I want him to vote because I want him to take that. I want him to take that action. He'll say, and his friends will say, "But we're in New York City. It doesn't matter. Our vote doesn't matter because we're not a swing state, or we're not a state that can tip the election." But I think that it is still important to raise your voice. It is still important to put that on a piece of paper and say, "This is what I think." And I actually was in a chat room the other day, and I can't remember. Obviously, the government, Trump and riots came, and I used Switzerland as an example. I think Switzerland. I said, well, they were talking about democracy, and they were talking about being democratic, and I'm like, you guys are all fucking stupid. This isn't a democracy. You want to talk about democracy? Go and look up, how Switzerland functions. All it takes is 25,000 voices, and the country has to address it. And that's a real democracy. That's where me, you, anyone can stand up and say, okay, well, I have an opinion, and I want my opinion to be heard. And they were like, wait, what do you mean? What are you talking about? It's something. The problem with Switzerland is it's too quiet. It doesn't tell anyone what it's doing, which I guess is its strength. But they were like, what do you mean? I said, this is a real democracy. It's one man, one vote. And any citizen, I said, the citizens have a voice. Here in this country, the citizens do not have a voice, which is why they have to riot.
Yeah, that's true. That's a good point to conclude.